Hi, my name is Sophia Kianni, and I'm a 20-year-old Iranian-American climate activist. I work with the UN on their youth advisory group on climate change, and I'm currently a junior at Stanford studying climate policy. I want to talk to you all about my journey as a youth climate activist, some of the major things that the youth climate movement has been able to accomplish, and how I think that you and everyone can contribute by becoming a climate activist. So when we look at the gravity of the youth climate movement, throughout high school, I was working with Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Zero Hour, some of the largest grassroots climate organizations in the world. And when I was a junior in high school, when I was just 17, I went viral for staging a hunger strike in Nancy Pelosi's office. And you can see that headline. I was the 17-year-old who skipped class. I skipped my econ quiz because I felt that it was so important to use my voice to highlight the issue of the climate crisis and the fact that our nation's politicians were calling the Green New Deal a Green New Dream. And so throughout high school, I was engaged with these different grassroots climate organizations, really with the goal of making sure that we were getting the general public to pay attention. And most significantly, we really were able to change the world by getting over 6 million people out into the streets to strike in 2019. And that was particularly significant because it was the first time that we had seen this international mobilization of people coming together to strike for climate. And this is akin to the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage era, where we see that nonviolent civil disobedience is going to be key if we're going to get nations to actually take action on climate and to understand that this is an emergency. But it's been several years since we were able to galvanize these people in a global movement, and the pandemic really did stall a lot of our momentum. Young people went from striking in the streets to being cooped up inside and not being able to have the same impact. And now we're just a few days away, actually, from COP27, which is when our world's leaders are going to congregate together in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt to take collective action towards the world's climate goals as agreed upon in the Paris Climate Agreement. So I'm going to be heading to Egypt right after this, even though I should technically be at Stanford right now attending class. And yet we see that so often, because our political leaders lack courage, the issue of climate, the burden has fallen on the shoulders of young people like me to take up the mantle of change and to use our voices to raise awareness about this critical issue. And so we need to move forward. We need stakeholders, we need civil society, political leaders to come together to see how can we actually make a difference. Years and years have passed. This is the 27th COP, and yet we are still missing the mark and are not on track to meet staying below 1.5 degrees of warming. And the biggest thing that I now, through my work as a climate activist, have learned is I think we need to move people from apathy to action. So just a few years ago, 40% of adults in the world had never heard of climate change. And we've made enormous strides since then. The Yale Center for Climate Communications has found around 70% of people in the US now believe in climate change, and general climate literacy and enthusiasm is increasing. But I think that the critical step that we are now missing is that we need to move people from being apathetic towards the climate crisis, so recognizing that the issue of climate is a big deal, but not necessarily not knowing what they can do about it, feeling the sense of being overwhelmed and powerless and not understanding how they can contribute, and actually explaining to people what it is that they can do. And I think that this can take a number of different forms. I look at my peers at Stanford and see some of them are working on engineering more sustainable textiles, others are creating more efficient solar panels, so everyone can make a difference. It's just about taking that first step towards action, which is when it started for me. So this is an issue that's very personal to me because of my experience growing up visiting Iran when I was just 12 years old, when I realized that pollution was hospitalizing thousands of people, and the Middle East was really suffering on the front lines of a climate crisis, with temperatures there rising more than twice the global average. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that climate change is really a human rights issue, which was something that I realized when I was visiting Iran, because I realized that the crisis of drought, water mismanagement, and the issue, it all was disproportionately impacting women, children. 80% of people who are climate refugees actually are women and people of color, because of issues like environmental racism, are actually facing the brunt of the climate crisis. And so from an early age, I really became aware to the fact that I had to look at climate as an intersectional issue. And I also realized that there was a lack of climate resources available in Farsi, which is Iran's native language. And so it was hard for me to communicate with my relatives about the issue. And it really highlighted the fact that the people who are being worst impacted by the climate crisis often lack access to the resources they need to make sense of this disaster that is impacting their communities. And of course, I also can't fail to mention that in Iran right now, there really is a human rights revolution that's happening, that's being led by young women. And you can see the UN Human Rights Council talking about how it's developing nations, the poorer countries, that are facing the brunt of the climate crisis, which is why it's so important for us at COP to really champion this $100 billion climate pledge for rich nations to pay for poorer nations and developing nations. For example, Africa, where right now they are facing the brunt of the world's climate crisis in terms of drought and how it's impacting people there, but then they actually are one of the least emitting countries. So there is this imbalance where it is an obligation for countries like the US to contribute funding towards this $100 billion climate pledge. And I took all of my learnings throughout high school, my experience in Iran, to ultimately, in my senior year of high school, start Climate Cardinals, which is an international youth-led nonprofit that works to make climate education more accessible to people who don't speak English. And so we launched with a viral TikTok video, and were able to recruit over 9,000 student volunteers across 40 countries. And we've now translated over 500,000 words of climate resources into over 100 languages. And so something that initially just started out as me and my mom translating climate resources into Farsi so that I could teach my relatives about climate change in Iran has now turned into a global movement of thousands of young people from over 40 countries coming together because they care so much about the issue of climate and want to make sure that everyone everywhere can access the resources they need to make a difference. Gen Z is the future. We are the future of the climate movement. We are future political leaders. And I think it's very important also to mention that social media has played such a crucial role in all of my activism and my advocacy. And I did this talk at Wired with Sylvia Earle, who's a hero of mine. And we talked about how the future of climate activism is going to be intergenerational. And it's also going to rely on factors like TikTok to help us get the message out there. From my childhood bedroom in the pandemic, I was able to spark a global movement only because of the power of social media. And it's going to be something that's going to be critical as we continue to think critically about the role that tech can play in furthering social movements. And now I work with the United Nations as a youth advisor to the UN Secretary General, really highlighting the importance of how Gen Z can work with political leaders to make an impact by leveraging the skills that we've learned in terms of social media, as well as our holistic intersectional approach towards why climate justice is so important. And I highlight this as an example because it really is the first instance of any international political body integrating young people at the highest levels of decision making. And it is a model that I hope is continued to iterate upon in the future. So I urge all of you to step up for Gen Z, to stand up for sustainability. Young people are increasingly suffering from climate anxiety, where because the climate crisis continues to get worse and we aren't seeing progress made towards these climate goals, 83% of Gen Zers are incredibly concerned about the planet's health. And with the midterms coming up in the United States, I want to also use this as an opportunity to urge you all to vote. Ultimately, the way that we're going to make change happen is through systemic processes. When we look at the countries, the companies that are disproportionately contributing to the climate crisis, 100 companies are responsible for just 71% of the world's industrial emissions. And so ultimately, as much as you or I do, it's really important to hold these companies, to hold these corporations accountable. And I think that tech can play a huge role in all of this in terms of bringing together policymakers, people from the private sector, leaders to champion young people and to ensure that we all are coming together to work on solving the most existential crisis currently facing humanity. So we need to stand up and change the world together, and let's use tech to do it. Thank you.